Hello and welcome to Beyond Top 10 Tennis. My name is Dr. Ashley Morgan Berge and I'm your host. I'm the author of 11 books, a CEO of 12 years, a founder of a startup set on data privacy, most importantly, an elite performance coach of over 18 years, having worked with athletes throughout Europe, the United States to Australia. And most excitingly, I am the world's leading scientist on coach and athlete performance, specifically behind how to develop a top 10 tennis ranking. My work includes everything from mitigating injuries to conditioning behaviors that set a player up long term for the long game towards a top 10 tennis ranking. I'm behind theories from the optimal performance theory, optimal behavior for optimal performance, the barrier breaker, the rule of transference to the golden rule. As has become custom, each episode we dive into one of my books to share additional insights and to dig a little bit deeper. We've been focusing on the secrets to optimal performance success, a comprehensive discussion on developing elite coaches and players. Now we have more than 30 episodes now to date. So for those of you who have been following along for some time now, thank you so much. But for those of you who this may be one of your first episodes, thank you so much. I'm sure you'll catch up and you'll see where we're going, and just hopefully you really enjoy yourselves. And look, as always, buckle in and enjoy the ride. Thank you so much again for joining us today. Today's topic, it's really important and close to my heart. And I think if you are one of those who have been with us for some time now, you know there are a number of topics that are close to my heart, but this one I think really sums it up. And obviously, again, if you're new, I'm sure you'll see where we're going soon enough. Look, if you want to follow along, today we're on page 195, and the topic we are about, yeah, you've guessed it, is injuries in junior athletes, not just tennis, and how it's connected to their technique. And look, I will focus on tennis primarily today, but look, there are so many cross sections to other sports. So if you are one of those players, athletes in another sport, or you're a parent and your child in another sport, or you're a coach in another sport, it really doesn't matter, because the best thing about this body of work is that it's transferable. And I'm sure you've heard in today's intro and many other intros that I'm behind a theory, essentially is the rule of transference. And in a nutshell, it essentially talks about how there are those key indicators to parameters where we can transfer these metrics to other sports. So it's not just tennis, but also how the tennis player's game can also be amplified by using similar principles. So we've gotten to this point because we've stood on the shoulders of giants, so to speak, and there's such an extensive body of work before us. And this body of work, which is more than 150,000 inferences, it's absolutely substantial that we get to say this is what's behind us. And we keep growing and growing from that with the work and the research and the scientific underpinnings. And we're at the point now where Beyond Top 10 Tennis gets to leverage that, and we get to talk about how. And so back to obviously how we transfer, it's essentially how we collate the data and we look at those intersections. And it's not always there, but when we're looking specifically at this work, how to develop a top 10 tennis player, and the technical parameters, these techniques they occur inadvertently and sometimes directly as well in other sports, which is incredibly exciting. Some sports, for example, are really easy, from baseball to softball, and there are almost direct correlations in some cases. Others that may not be as apparent could be basketball to netball. And one of those skills there is obviously that hand-eye coordination. But specifically when we're touching on a coach's framework, which I've referred to in the past as a coach's pedagogy. So the foundations of what builds an exceptional coach, so an elite coach that is responsible for developing the 1%. And I think every coach should aspire to be in that, those numbers, so to speak. And you get there by being familiar with the 7 keys. And obviously that book, you may or may not be familiar with it, is the 7 keys to optimize your life. But that is actually my first text that uses tennis with the rule of transference, where it draws on other professions to careers to sporting dynamics, just to showcase how powerful this is. And I don't want to get too off topic, whereas I acknowledge that everything essentially is interconnected here. But when we're looking at injuries and the prevalence and how they occur in, especially whether it's those junior athletes to the more elite, there are really similarities across the board there. And why I am so passionate about this, if you've been following along for some time now, you know why. But for those of you who haven't, it's because I was one of those athletes absolutely riddled with injuries. And one of our previous episodes touched on peak performances. And I will give a very, very brief recap here. Is that what used to happen is that I would get injured and then I'd do my rehabilitation, I'd get back to the level I was at, and then I'd reach my next peak performance and I was ready. I was at my absolute peak, and then I'd get injured again. And it was a cycle, and it was a very vicious cycle that you would peak, then drop, then peak, then drop. So all the work that would go into recovering, so the rehabilitation process, from an injury to get back to the level you were at, and then some more, so to make those progressions, and then to fall by the wayside again. It's absolutely heartbreaking. And I know I'm not alone there. I know that unfortunately a lot of athletes do experience this, irrespective what level you're at. You may be on the ATP and or WTA tour. You could be on the ITF Challenger tours and or circuits respectively. And or you could be at your local club academy, and this cycle could be very new, whether you're that 14, 15, 16-year-old. That's actually around the age it started happening for me personally. So for the parents out there, it can unfortunately start very young if the right protocols are not in place. And when we talk about protocols and what's in place, we really need to talk back to, so refer back to that coach education framework or that cycle there. And so specifically I'll talk to the athletes, the players and the parents here, is that essentially there obviously you need a certification to become a coach, ideally. Some players, they don't all have that. They purely go on their background, whether they're a player, and then they transition to become a coach, and they don't do the work. More often than not, specifically, especially in Australia, you do need that certification, whether it's your baseline, so that level 1, or it goes more advanced is level 2, and level 3 is the top. So it's the highest certification you can get to. Now, overseas, so let's say in North America, for example, to the UK, there can be different versions. Some federations use a level 5, for example, whereas the Australian level 1 is coupled into, say, a 1-2 over there, and or that 3-4 would refer to a level 2 here, and that level 3 in Australia would refer to that 5, for example, as a reference point. But, and I've touched it again on a previous episode, that it's so important to remember these are baseline certifications. These are not diplomas. These are not associate degrees. These are not undergraduate degrees. They are not masters. They are not doctorates. They are the absolute initial beginning baseline of a certification, which means these people are not performed by people who have those higher educational degrees. And more often than not, they can be by someone in the field who's quite experienced. More often than not, that's the case. It's someone who is a level 2, level 3, or 5 for those who are based overseas. And you can see where I'm going. The problem here is that the literature isn't necessarily updated, and or the presenters in that respect are not privy or not conscious of those updates, because there's no crossover to the academic side. So you really need to look towards those who may have, for example, personally, my master's is in sports coaching, because that was the next step above a bachelor's degree. So the next level really is a diploma and that associate degree before you get your bachelor's degree. And I was already there. So then I went and got my master's to see, what's missing, because there's many voids there, and you're not conscious of the gaps at that level unless you really do have, I think, that academic background where you're incredibly curious to know more. Now, as that athlete who got injured so much, I wanted to make sure I could really safeguard the players, athletes that I'd be working with. And from my personal perspective, it just wasn't enough. Most excitingly though, when I realized I wanted to go ahead and do my doctorate, so I really could unravel this, and that's obviously where Beyond Top 10 Tennis has stemmed, and my 11 books that I've published has stemmed. But it's so important for the parents and the players, athletes out there to be conscious of those gaps, and the gaps will happen, and that's okay, but to be maybe prepared for that on one side, but to also do your own due diligence. And so obviously what I mean by that is that do the work, read what's new from that scientific literature, be curious, be intrigued on what else. Because at the end of the day, if you are working with an exceptional coach that has that certification but not that higher education that's specific, and I really need to stress the specific, because you do obviously have those a myriad of higher education degrees, the undergraduates to the postgraduates to the doctorates, that are not specific necessarily in these fields. They're exceptional in their own right, but not specifically in this field. So, and I really need to, I think, underscore here that I'm talking to you from that place of the world's leading scientist in this area, because my work unraveled how specifically to develop that top 10 tennis ranking. Now, obviously, every researcher's, scientist's perspective, they're going to uncover something new and or add value to that. And that's obviously what underscores academia and the significance of that and its contribution to the world we live in and know, etc. So when you really want to amplify your performance, it does you so much good by being conscious and aware of that, but also its relevance and being very conscious of that relevance. So to the coaches out there, and I've spoken to this as well, and again, going back to injuries and preventing injuries, mitigating injuries, the best advice that I have for you is harnessing the 7 keys. Now, I've got 10 specific texts that take you through. Now, if you look at one of the texts that I've talked about in more recent episodes, it's called I'm Your Tennis Coaching Guru. It is 10 years of lessons and planners and progressions. That's huge. It is absolutely significant, but it intersects with the 7 keys, which means that you can take your player from whether they're 7 or 8 years old, for example, they may be a little bit younger or under or a little bit older. You can take them through 10 years towards their peak. And when I say their peak, towards prior to and or at the beginning of transitioning on tour. So they've gotten progressed that good that they're about to become a professional. And that's incredibly exciting. And then it sets you up for that next 10 years. So it's actually 20 years of play. And by following that blueprint, so to speak, and obviously the 7 keys and being knowledgeable of that, you are empowering not only yourself, but also the player and athlete to mitigate injuries. So for the parents out there, the biggest question is, does the coach your child is working with, are they familiar with the 7 keys? Do they have access to the body of work, and have they upskilled? And that is probably the biggest precursor at this stage, because the coach education system we know is void of all of this, unfortunately. However, if you obviously are a coach education provider, it's there to implement. So it's not in the shadows, it's not hidden. It's been designed by AMA International to be accessible for everyone, opposed to a singular federation. And I have said that and repeated this so many times over the last 30 plus episodes, but for good reason. So to let the players and athletes and coaches know that it's there. It's not hidden, it's there. If you want to, and if you're serious about progressing towards a top 10 tennis ranking, and obviously today's topic about mitigating injuries, it's possible. The work is there and you can upskill. You do not need an undergraduate degree. Obviously, it helps. And when I say it helps, it's that structure. So that structural thinking of being able to problem solve, etc. That's obviously ingrained in you in various ways throughout that learning cycle. And obviously, whether that's followed by a master's, etc. Because I'm a big believer of academia, and I acknowledge my bias because I know personally what it's done for me, and how I was, my levels, for example, prior, and what happened at each different increment. And I think that comes with growth. And if you obviously are that player athlete, you want to grow and you want to continue to grow. And that obviously is correlated with your performance and your ranking ascending towards that top 10. And so at the same time, you need that coach that's going to grow with you. And growth is an incredible precursor for excellence, and a top 10 tennis ranking, essentially, when we're looking at that transference, is excellence embodied with obviously that ranking. And you are incredibly capable of that, whether you are that coach and or that player athlete, by following the long game and the pathway which is set out on AMA International. But the 7 keys get you there, and so it's harnessing that. All right, that's a very good or significant, I think, introduction that was really necessary to share, I think, the backstory, but to dig a little bit deeper than maybe previous episodes to share, I think that story, so to speak, because as this episode is obviously going to come to air, and I've touched on this a few times, that I'm working on my next book, which really lengthens and encapsulates this. So I'm giving you, I think, a sneak peek in the best of ways, I hope, in that respect, and how it's so important. All right, so again, if you want to follow along today, we're on page 195. Here we go. Too often I hear about junior athletes being injured. As a former tennis player, having played in the National Collegiate Athletic Association, NCAA, and prior to that on a full-time basis for 8 hours a day, 5 to 6 times a week, injuries were commonplace for me growing up. However, as I got older, I realized that injuries do not have to be all so common. It is so important now to underline 8 hours a day. I used to train for up to 8 hours a day. From memory, the structure would have been something along the lines of 2 to 3 hours in the morning, followed by specifically an hour to 2 of strength work, just stretching. Sometimes I'd spend up to a whole hour, that's 60 minutes of stretching my body, and then I would do it again. I'd head back out on court, but I would work lighter, so it could be 30 minutes just specifically working on my ball toss and getting that right, and then I could work on another 1 to 2 hours of different progressions by myself, and then with a hitting partner and or coach. Or it could be a lesson with a coach, my coach at the time, and then I would go off and do my own work with a hitting partner, and that was an extensive amount of work, and it was almost back then encouraged that you had to do that much work. Now, if you've been following along for some time now, hopefully you are like, oh my goodness, because I will say this, and please rewind and listen to it as many times as you need to. You do not need to train for 8 hours a day. You do not. That was a significant error that was not picked up or pulled up when I was a junior, that also underscores those injuries. Ironically, I was at a local club a couple of months ago now, and there were players who were almost doing the same, where they would go from a squad session of 2 hours and a private lesson, so a one-on-one session with their coach, so that's 3 hours, and sometimes that's morning and afternoon, and sometimes you've got athletes who are not at school, and so during the day they will only do, say, 2 hours max of school, and they will do other activities and or recovery. So when I say stretching, they'll do a similar component of that, and then they'll head back to it, and then they will do it over again the next day. And it is a significant number, and a lot of these athletes are already carrying injuries, and you wonder why. So if you are a player athlete out there and you have an injury, I need you please to reassess your schedule and ask yourself why. If you are unsure, please reach out to AMA International and I will personally get back to you. Even better, obviously we have go on AMA International and we have those subscriber options, so you get weekly access, and I will help you because that it's just not okay. Let's say, to leverage it as an addition to your current training load to help guide. So specifically for the parents out there as well, it's to help guide to mitigate those injuries. Coaches, please upskill, if not already, to be very conscious of the volume for that player athlete, and likewise with the parents and your child, to be very conscious of that, because it is, once upon a time it used to be a sign of, you've been working so hard, that's great, you've got an injury, now you need to recover. Now I think there's still a little bit of that going on, especially at the junior ranks, so during the developmental phases, which goes from, that 10, 12 years of age potentially up to, that 16, 17 year age bracket. Injuries are not fun. Injuries do not need to be had. The right recovery needs to be done. The right strength and conditioning needs to be done. If you are not incorporating strength and conditioning in your weekly training load, you really need to reassess. Last week's episode specifically touched on periodization, and we've got a couple of blogs that touched on that as well. So it's really important to refer to that and to be really mindful of that, because your strength work should be incorporated in that. If you do have some type of niggle, so the onset potentially of an injury, it's so important that one, you have a really good chat with your coach about what's happened, what's caused it. Take the time off to really get it looked at, see get a recommendation to see ideally a physiotherapist, and you will be given additional strength work. The latest research says strength is what we want to rehabilitate, not just time off, not just stretching. We need strength. So I really encourage the coaches, parents, players, athletes to be mindful of that, because essentially, now I won't go into too much detail here, but in a nutshell, you can go, all right, if your body has so many strenuous demands, what's your frame? What's holding that up to prevent those injuries from happening? And that's where strength comes into play. And if you're able to build a strong body, a strong frame, you're also protecting yourself. So it's almost like a double layer, so to speak. Okay, let's keep going. You might think that this isn't a natural process, being injured, as after all, I'm sure many parents out there experience the same old injuries as their children might have already or are currently experiencing. And this is hilarious, because most parents and or coaches think it is a natural process, and so the players, athletes are not surprised when this happens. Coming from someone who has literally had too many injuries to name, when I was old enough, I began to question why I kept getting these injuries, because there was nothing more frustrating than getting back to form and ready to play in the next big tournament before succumbing to another injury. What I found was that everything kept coming back to my technique. The best thing about this body of work is that on one hand it's technical, so I'll really talk now towards that technical side. For those of you may or may not be familiar with the technical parameter that obviously is extensively discussed through my work is referred to as the V by Dr. B. And it was given that name, so it was V and B. You were able to ideally remember it, the V by Dr. B, and to really ring that home. And what I mean by that is that it's been designed from that language standpoint to recall, be able to refer to in that context. And the V by Dr. B has different inferences, so different technical parameters, but it's been developed also to mitigate injuries. Initially, when it was designed, it was set out to look at the performance metrics, and it was correlated with a top 10 tennis ranking, which is incredibly exciting. And this is, however, only part of the body of work. But specifically, when we look at mitigating injuries and the technical parameters that are necessary, we need a relative understanding of biomechanics. So how our body works, how our body functions. So one of our earlier episodes is around functional movement, and we have I think a good 4 to 6 episodes on that. So please do yourself a favor and catch up on that, because functional movement is the human body working how it's designed to work, opposed to compromising a muscle and or compromising just how the body is meant to move naturally. So when we look at the V by Dr. B, for example, we know that it's functional. And when you use a functional movement and you're not compromising your body, in the most simplest sense, you are mitigating the onset of injury, because you are moving how your body was designed to move, opposed to not. Now, a really easy example in tennis would be given. Everyone, I'm sure, has heard of potentially tennis elbow. Now, typically, one of the causes of tennis elbow is by hitting the ball behind you or too close to you when you're looking at the forehand and making impact, so contact with the ball. And often this happens behind the elbow joint, so it's away opposed to in front of that elbow and or not too far. So the stress, so impact of that ball is heading to the elbow opposed to in front of the body, and where that elbow is naturally designed to then be at that extension of your arm to hit the ball, because your elbow essentially is a lever to your shoulder, your wrist, etc. So everything's interconnected. But the irony here is that it's so simple from an outsider's perspective. If you have a relative awareness around biomechanics and the human body, you go, well, you need to make sure that player athlete hits the ball in front. And it's that simple. So if you catch your child, for the parents out there, hitting the ball behind them, you know the likelihood of them developing tennis elbow is incredibly high if they continue and it's not picked up, so that it's not modified and or rectified to align with a performance that is mitigating a potential injury. Now, that is just one of many joints in the body that's responsible for performing. So there are many other examples, but I think it's a very common one and similar. Well, when we're looking at obviously the elbow. Now I say similar in respect to, we call that an angle of influence. Now the V by Dr. B is designed on multiple angles of influence. So it's quite in depth, but that is why we have 10 books that talk you through it. Yeah, because I cannot stress this enough that my work's been spread out and or designed over these books to talk you through it, opposed to communicating with you through a more scientific language, the scientific jargon that is not as readily understood and or understandable from that parent, coach, player, athlete perspective. And I've been very incredibly conscious of that from that former player coach standpoint, because I know how important it is to be able to work through that and put those steps in action. Okay, I have good news on the injury front. These don't have to be commonplace. Whether your sport of choice is tennis or any other sport for that matter, where you aren't in harm's way, think National Rugby Leagues or the NRL, for example, where you can't stop another person tackling you over and getting a bit worse for wear from it. That is a simple answer. The technique you're using and have been conditioned to use holds the answer. And I think the point of reference around the elbow there is one of many when you're looking at your technique, because irrespective if we're looking at the backhand and we're looking at your biomechanics and we're referring to functional movement patterns, and we're diving into obviously the scope of human movement, and we're looking at how we're able to develop an optimal outcome, that is where the V by Dr. B comes in, because it's again transferable forehand to backhand, and it's correlated with a top 10 tennis ranking, which means if you begin developing that now for that developmental athlete, whether you're 10, 11, 12 or you're 17, 18, the earlier you adopt this technical parameter, this technique as well, the greater your rate of success, because you're able to reach a level of autonomy sooner, and then you're able to progress varying different metrics. Now that's going to get a little bit more complicated, because when we're looking at the WTA ATP Tour player, so I'll talk to you now, if you are currently ranked around top 100 in the world, there's a very good chance that you are not executing the V by Dr. B. And I say this with absolute confidence with the body of work, because we know that, and we've looked at the players in this ranking range and what's correlated, obviously their performance. There's a reason why you're 100 in the world and you're not top 20 in the world. By all means, there are additional factors associated with those results. However, we also know that if you increase your frequency and capacity of these specific inferences, your ranking ascends, which means it goes from 100 to 80. It goes from 80 all the way down to 40 and towards the top 10. Potentially, if your frequency is high enough, you become a barrier breaker. However, There is a lot to do with that. And one of the biggest metrics there is an athlete's ability to position themselves. More often than not, athletes do not have the capacity to position themselves if they are ranked, 200, 300, even 150, because their movement is not there. So I cannot stress enough the importance of that strength work that also works on amplifying your movement to allow you to execute the V by Dr. B, but also we're looking at mitigating injuries whilst amplifying your performance and the technical, the influence, the drawbacks, but also the wins. So what happens when you're able to establish that foundation and move the marker to the next level? All sports have a technique they need to use to execute a certain shot, skill, or action. This technique, if coached incorrectly, results in not only performing the technique how you've the player been coached, but you will keep using the technique because you are none the wiser. After all, your coach told you so. I was in the same boat. I kept using the same technique my coach had told me until I started piecing things together, at the time unknown, and what my PhD in part addressed. And I think we're going to wrap things up on that because my PhD, my doctorate, obviously we've gone over this, but yeah, uncovered what we can execute to become that top 10 tennis player, and that's where the V by Dr. B obviously falls into place. But specifically here, when we're looking at injuries, how we can mitigate injuries, and obviously from that athlete's perspective and the technical perspective as well, the V by Dr. B is absolutely significant. It is one of the best benchmarks for success, which is incredibly, it can be overwhelming, but it's incredibly rewarding at the same time, being able to harness that level of knowledge and apply it through your performance. And what we know is the higher you are in the rankings, your capacity and or frequency increases, which I have touched on earlier. But when we're looking at how it is connected to their technique, and obviously not being none the wiser, how I think that last paragraph summed up, that really touches back to the beginning of the episode when I was talking about that coach education system, so that structure and that knowledge base. Potentially your coach is not aware of the 7 keys, and obviously one of those in there underscores what I've been talking about. And it's really important then from this perspective, if you do have your sights set on becoming a professional athlete, so a professional tennis player, that you're working with a coach who is privy to the 7 keys, because that is another metric we've uncovered and that we obviously have spoken about previously, but just subtly. But it's so important that I think today's episode I'm giving more and more in respect to going, if you apply this and you have the knowledge of this, you are set up for this. And when obviously this is underscored by that top 10 tennis ranking, the sooner you develop these metrics, the better. The good news, however, that we know that if you're on tour and you're currently ranked 50 in the world, you can implement these into your game and ascend towards the top 10 within the next 2 to 3 seasons, which is incredible. So that essentially sums up that with the next 2 to 3 years, you increase your capacities, and that your rate of progress will correlate with that ranking if it is upkept and continued. And that is, however, associated with your coach's pedagogy and its reliance on the 7 keys. If that coaching pedagogy is not inclusive of the 7 keys, then that's not the case. And that is, I think, incredibly substantial in and of itself, because, and again, my current, the body of work I'm currently working on is around that. And I'm really looking forward to releasing that. Hopefully later this year, though we're going to see how that goes, because it's something that's so important to me, and it's been in the works, believe it or not, for over 10 years. It has been on the sideline with all the other books that have come out because there are steps that we need to take as coaches and as athletes before we get to this marker. And this is a substantial marker that I've been holding on to for an extended amount of time until you were given the answers that are needed prior. And obviously the answers needed prior was the build up to the 7 keys, and obviously the 7 keys encompassed and explained on how it correlates with that top 10 ranking, and unraveling how we can mitigate injuries in junior athletes, set them up for success for the long game, and put them on a 10-year pathway towards potentially that top 10 tennis ranking, and or setting them up in their first decade of play. So in their second decade of play, whether that's between 18, for example, and 28 years of age, that they are poised to ascend towards the top 10. And I think that's what it's all about, that we want to mitigate injuries. We want to set the players, athletes up for success to head towards that top 10. And we do that by including and or adopting what we've discussed today, and obviously in previous episodes, but there are really significant key metrics that I've touched on today. And when we couple these together, we get what we're after, which is that top 10 tennis ranking. Thank you so much for joining us today. I know I think we started off really with a bit of a punch there, and then we slowed things down, and then we took a bit of a segue and we got into the Be by Dr. B and a Coach's Pedagogy, which are hugely significant pieces when we're looking at that top 10 tennis ranking, that they are embedded in the 7 keys. They are that powerful, and they are definitely embedded in that body of work I'm currently working on, and I'm really looking forward to when that happens. Hopefully this year, but we will see how things track, but within the next 6 months. So I think today's episode is one to, mark on your calendar and to refer back to. Okay, on that, to grab a copy of The Secrets to Optimal Performance Success, head on over to AMAT International. That's amatinternational.com. For any comments or questions, head on over to AMAT or Topic Thread. That is the only social network that I am on. To interact with Beyond Top 10 Tennis, head on over to Twitter, Threads, LinkedIn, or Instagram, or TikTok to catch up on our weekly coaching tips. They are on TikTok and other platforms. To catch up on our blogs, they are on AMAT International under our blogs tab, or you can head directly over to Medium as well. And as always, I will leave all the links in the episode notes. For something different, head on over to Pink Octopus Books, and that's where my fictional release is. And to view this week's questions and polls, be sure to visit Spotify. And for something different, a bit left of field, visit Spruik for some random polls. And I know I dropped a lot of words and or pages. All of the links are in the episode notes for ease to just click on, refer to nice and straightforward. And of course, if you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, like, share, and or all of the above would be absolutely phenomenal. For those of you who have, thank you so much. And for those of you who are yet to, please send through your feedback anyway. I would absolutely love to hear it, because it allows us to get even better and to deliver on what you're really after too. And for those of you who are interested, and I did touch on this briefly in today's episodes, we have subscriptions available on AMA, which give you access to an elite coaching cohort for the athletes. So you get to work together with me as we ascend towards the top 10, but we also have scholarships available as well. Irrespective if you're based in Australia, Europe, North America, it really doesn't matter. They have been designed to be accessible for you. And I'm really excited about that. And I'm looking forward to those of you who are interested to helping you nudge a little bit closer towards that top 10 tennis ranking. So don't be shy and come and say hi. On that note, thank you so much for listening. I am so incredibly grateful. I'm your host, Dr. Ashley Morgan Berge, and this is Beyond Top 10 Tennis, and I'll see you next time.